Thursday morning, live from Las Vegas. Philipp, you are talking to us from Berlin?
Yes, from Berlin.
Okay, I can see the background. I want to welcome all the participants, colleagues and students. You know me, I'm Stefan Lehmann, Professor of Architecture at the University of Nevada. And the joint AIA School of Architecture series Spring 2022 is a collaboration between the AIA Las Vegas, AIA Nevada, and the UNLV School of Architecture. Thank you to the American Institute and to Kelly Savine for organizing all with the registrations. And as you know, the theme is European Voices. And we had previously lectures by Italian architect Carlo Ratti at MIT and Dutchman Winnie Maas from MBRDV. And today's lecture is public and will be by Dr. Philipp Meuser from Berlin, who is currently between Boston and Berlin, where he is a visiting professor at Brown University. And I'm thrilled that today's presentation will be on a topic that we usually do not hear necessarily too much about: the urbanization of Sub-Saharan Africa. And before I introduce our speaker, Philipp Meuser, I want to briefly mention the relevance of the topic. There are 54 countries in Africa today, and Africa has an urban population of around 600 million people. And some cities are real mega cities. Just think of Kinshasa or Lagos, which are both estimated to have over 15 million population. Some statistics even estimate that Lagos has already over 21 million population, or Cairo with 10 million, and so on. So these are large mega cities, and there are significant differences between cities in, let's say, North America, Europe, and Africa. For example, the role and the way public space is used. So we are very interested to hear about this, and new built cities also come to mind, like Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, a town designed in the late 70s with a master plan by Kenzo Tange that has a staggering annual growth of 35%, making it the fastest growing city in the world. So very interesting. Today we will hear from an expert in this field, and it's my great pleasure to now introduce Philipp Meuser, who's a practicing architect based in Berlin. Philipp was born in 1969 in Germany. He studied architecture at the Technical University of Berlin, where he later completed also a PhD. And in 1996, he established his own practice, Meuser Architekten, together with his wonderful wife, Natasha Meuser. And in 2005, he founded Dome Publisher, which is a very active publishing house for books on architecture and urbanism. And together with Adil Dalbai, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, Philipp is the author of a guide to Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the architecture guide that covers the history of 49 African countries. And it's a 3,400 pages guidebook, comes in 7 volumes to the architecture of Africa, and architecture that has recently now received more attention with latest Pritzker Prize winner Francis Kéré from Burkina Faso. I would imagine writing on Africa as a European has, of course, its challenges, given its colonial past. No doubt we will hear more about this. The practice Meuser Architekten is focused on the design of German embassies in Africa and other places, which is interesting as it triggers all kinds of questions about the national and cultural representation of a country and its culture through architecture abroad, which is always interesting to us, questions of identity. So I hope you will enjoy the lecture, which will go for 50 minutes, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. Please, all participants, send me your questions via the chat box. Use the chat box function, and the lecture will be recorded and later added to our growing archive on YouTube. Without further ado, Philipp, we are super happy to have you, to hear from you about African cities. So over to you. Thank you, Philipp.
Stefan, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. I'm always happy to talk about Africa. As Stefan already mentioned, it's a challenge as a white European to talk about Africa. Why I am doing that? The reason is quite simple. I have been working in Africa for nearly 10 years now as an architect, and wherever we work as architects, we mainly work abroad. We always try to dive into the history and theory of architecture, just to get familiar with the place, to get familiar with the culture we are working in. And especially as if you work as an architect for the German Federal Foreign Office, it's quite important in my understanding that you need to know the country, you need to know how the planning and building process is managed or how it is organized. And I'm always saying, whenever you understand the architecture and the urban planning of a culture, you really get to know, or you really know a lot about the system in general. So this is just what is always important to talk about if you talk about Africa. So my background, Stefan mentioned that already. So I have been working in foreign countries, especially in Central Asia. So this is when I was starting the embassy business, let's say. And from these post-socialist and post-Soviet regions, we have been working to westward, and we have been working in North Africa, but also in Western Africa. And Sub-Saharan Africa is in my experience, it's an area which is completely unknown. It's a territory unknown for architects in Europe, and this was one of the reasons also to start working with Adil Dalbay, who has been working as an architect in our office that time, to start this kind of guidebook. So I'm trying to share my presentation, and I would appreciate if you could just confirm you see my title page, Contemporary Urbanism, Urbanization of Sub-Saharan Africa.
You can see it.
What I'm going to talk about today. And as it is a common understanding, when architects talk about something, they always start to talk about projects, what they just finished. And so you see this image, so it's just working. So this is the German embassy in Bamako, Mali, and we just finished that half a year ago.
We don't see the slides moving. We only see the first slide.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, just return.
Now it's working. Now it's moving.
It's moving. And you see another picture now?
Yes.
All right.
Mosaic.
Okay, so the mosaic. So this was the picture I wanted to show you. So this is the front facade of the embassy, German embassy in Bamako, Mali, recently finished half a year ago. And so this is the interior. It looks more like a museum. But our idea was just to have a very light and fresh.
We don't see the slides moving. We still with the mosaic.
Okay, so I go out here. Let's start again. So not so easy. So now it should work.
We see the interior.
All right, so that means we might continue. So this is the way how we work, and this was, I'm quite proud that we also managed to work with local artists. Local artists were invited to do a kind of facade mosaic, some artwork, something what we also found in Bamako in architecture, which is not the very old architecture or indigenous architecture, but we also found in some colonial and post-colonial buildings. So we invited the people, and it was just it was really fun working with the local artists and the local workers on that kind of representative building for the German embassy. And so this is just how we work, and so we are currently working also in Burkina Faso. You were mentioning Francis Kéré. Yesterday I spent the whole day with Francis Kéré because we're just working on another embassy project for Burkina Faso as well. So we were presenting the competition. So Africa has become a very big part of my career in my architecture career, but also in the publishing career. And this is the first image I wanted to start with when we talk about urbanization processes in Africa. So this is it's a drone picture of a small village. It's not even a village. It's just a family. It's a community of family buildings in the savannah of Burkina Faso, and you see what kind of structure and what kind of architectural rules or planning rules we find even in this very, very small unit of a small part in a rural area of Burkina Faso. And this is what we find, and this is also what is so fascinating for me as a European architect. So we are all working in Europe, in the US. We all work in a civilization which has completely erased and covered these native structures, and this is what I find so interesting and fascinating talking about Africa or working in Africa. So everything is parallel. On one hand, you see all these modern skyscrapers. Later I will show some modern cities, but you can also see some very, very old structures, or I'm not saying old structures, but structures which are following a tradition of architecture and urban design, which has given from generation to generation, and it has not dramatically changed during all these centuries. And this is for European architect. You really have a possibility to come back to your roots, calm down, and you can really talk. You can really investigate and do some research on the basics on architecture. So this just for my understanding, or just to introduce myself. On the one hand, we do all these safety and security features with a small part of artworks and architecture for German embassies on the one hand, but on the other hand, my interest or my love goes to these kind of structures, what you find everywhere in Africa. So, and before talking about the civilization, these urban structures and the urbanization processes in Africa, I also have to show you this this slide with the keywords body space theory, and so it might be surprising for some of you who have never thought about, is there any architecture in Africa? Is there any theory in architecture? And I can tell you, so this is my experience. Wherever you go on this planet, you will find decoration of the body. You will find decoration of the buildings, of the residential buildings where the people live. But you also have a theory on architecture. Whereas I have to say that most of the cultures in Africa, they never had a written language, so everything was oral. So we, in some part or in major parts of Africa, we don't find books until the Europeans arrived from the 16th century. So everything is oral, but also in this oral culture, we find some theories. And when we talk about theory, I'm just quoting Ron Eglish, he calls himself an ethno-mathematician, and he has been working, or he has published a book on African fractals, but from the point of view, or from the point of the mathematician. And what he found out is, by investigating village structures, that you always find some repeating elements in these native family homesteads. So on the left-hand side, you see this is a floor plan of the head of the village, so the house of the head of the village. So then you see in the center, you see where the male head's house is located within the structure of the family, and each of these small huts has a different function. So you have the first wife, and it's polygamous cultures. You have second and third wives, and the children, and even the cattle is also housed within this kind of homestead. And so the family structure then itself is part of a smaller village. And you see that all these elements are just repeating themselves. Ron English calls this a proof for the fractals. And I could make a whole lecture only on architecture theory, on native African architecture. So just keep that in mind. So there is so much. So the subject itself is so rich, and I always can encourage and motivate, especially the young generation, to dive in this subject and to do some research. So in Africa, Africa is not only the big five, the lion, the rhino, and the hippo, and all these big animals, and it is not only beaches and palm trees and jungle. No, Africa is so rich on culture, and we always have to remind ourselves. So the human being, the Homo sapiens. So according to what we know today, so the first Homo sapiens, they lived in the eastern part of Africa, and from there they were moving and somehow conquering the whole world. So that means all our roots go back to Africa. And during all these years I've been working in Africa, I would also say that the roots of architecture also go back or lead us back to Africa. And it is always worth to work on this continent. So I'm taking you by your hand and just trying to give you a better understanding of urbanization processes and urban structure, urban culture in Africa. And so you will find so let's say the four chapters what might be not surprising for you. So I'm going to show you some traditional structures, village structures. I'm going to show you some colonial urban structures. Then these huge movement after independence. Most of the cities in Africa, they became independent in 1960. 1960 is considered as the year of Africa. And I'm closing my presentation with with an outlook, what is happening in the moment and what we can expect when we talk about urbanization processes in Africa. So Stefan already mentioned. So the processes what we find in the moment, they are so dramatic and so fast. So within the next 30 years, and all the young students among us, so it will be a part of you can't ignore what is happening in Africa. So within the next 30 years, the urban population in Africa will increase by 400 million people. So just imagine the whole US would be urbanized. And the question is, and this is the question for the future, when we talk about urbanization processes in Africa, we need to talk about the future of city in general. And then the next question would be, how would these 400 million people be housed, and what are we going to build for them? Just to be able to let them live in an appropriate life and condition in urban structures. So so just please allow me also just to go back to the very basic culture of urban culture. So it's also not a surprise. So the first urban cultures, what we know, they are also located in Africa. So this is Egypt. We have Mesopotamia. We have early structures in today's Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we have also early structures in the center of China. So when we talk about Europe and US in the moment today, so there was no urban culture, urban civilization when Egypt, Mesopotamia, Afghanistan, and also China had a blossoming culture in the urban areas, and Africa also, and this is also for some people it's quite surprising, in today's north of Nigeria, but also Ethiopia, and also on the east coast, we find structures of early urbanization processes which are nearly 2,000 years old. So, and what was the, so what influenced our today's view and knowledge on Africa? So of course this was during the period when the Europeans conquered first the coastlines of Africa, and so I'm just showing you, yeah, it's a view of the city of Luango, which is today in the Republic of Congo, and the Dutch guy Alfred Dapper, who was the first to show some images of African cities to the European audience. So in 1641, so shortly after the Mayflower had arrived to the east coast of the US. So the first, it was more or less, it was the same period when the first Europeans conquered the coastline of Africa. He was drawing this quite modern city, and I was really wondering, what the hell did he do? He was drawing. We see that on the left-hand side. It's just a detail of this drawing. So we see small townhouses, and they reminded me to another image I had in mind from Amsterdam. You see that on the right-hand side. So it's quite obvious that Alfred Dapper was just copying his view, how he remembered Amsterdam that time, and he just transferred that on Africa. And so I have never lived in the 17th century in Luango, and I did do a more deeper research on that. But what we can estimate, assume, is that he was just doing it by fantasy. So in fact, we don't know really how the city of Luango looked like. And this also happened more or less with the city of Benin. It was a little bit later. He was also traveling to Benin, to the Benin. It's not Benin state, but it's the Benin city, which is in the western part of today's Nigeria. And he was drawing. This is quite interesting. He was drawing the silhouette of the city of Benin, and the buildings what we see here. So drawn in the late 17th century. You see all these roofs, and the roofs are topped by some eagles or birds as a kind of decoration. And the next picture, what I'm showing you, is the top picture on the left-hand side. So this is Benin City in 1897. So it's at least 200 years later. And the city looked very similar. So the typology of the buildings, what we see, and this was a drawing made by a British soldier. And to the right-hand side, so we see, of course, it's not a model how we understand architecture models. So this is just a small box for jewelry, but this shows how the buildings looked like, because this is obviously this has been designed in the 17th century, but during all these 200 years, so we have a kind of proof that the city looked like this. The question remains, why do we know how Benin City looked like in 1897? So the reason is quite simple, but also sad. So the British troops, so they were just destroying this Benin City, and before it was destroyed, an unknown soldier was doing this kind of drawing. So we know at least, so it's another proof that there was an urban culture in Africa at that time already, which was already very, very old. When I'm talking about urban culture, I'm not only talking about somehow urban building typologies, but I'm also talking about urban culture, how the city was organized, how the city was ruled, and how the city was sustained by all this infrastructure, by all the water system and whatever was needed even today, how to run a city. So Benin, by the way, so whenever you continue doing some research on Benin, you will always find the Benin bronze. So Benin bronze is one of the key elements. So when we talk about a post-colonial responsibility of Europeans, or let's say the Western world, and we have a very strong discussion ongoing, especially in Germany, but also in France, of returning the so-called Benin bronze back to Nigeria, because they were all stolen during colonial times, but especially when Benin was completely destroyed, all the jewelries and the valuables were taken to Europe and given to museums, and they still keep it, and they even start asking the questions: do we really need to return those bronzes? So it's a huge discussion, would be another lecture today. So going back to the traditional urban structures, what we find in Africa. So I'm showing you another example from Zimbabwe. So this is a structure which is still a miracle today. It's called Great Zimbabwe, and so we know that these structures are already more than 900 years old, and no one really knows who was building them. We might only get an estimation what they were used for, but Great Zimbabwe is one of the few stone relicts or stone remainings from urban structures in the Sub-Saharan Africa. So, as I told you in the beginning, so we have lots of remains and relicts along the Nile River in Egypt, but just compared with the other part of Africa, Great Zimbabwe is still unique, and still today it remains a miracle. So what was the urbanization process? What happened in Africa? And from today's point of view, or let's say as a result from my long research, we really have to say that the urbanization process were very much pushed by the Europeans, and the Europeans, I said this before, they came to Africa, especially to the coastline, especially to the west coast, and in the 17th century, it was the century when it was possible for the military troops, or for the army, for the armadas from Portugal, from Spain, from the Netherlands, from Great Britain, also from France, to cross the oceans, to have far distances. Always was they were all heading to India, and as we know, Christoph Columbus, the guy who did not take the way to India to the east, how all the others did, he was going to the west, and then being surprised to find completely new continent called America, or the West Indies. So another case, another story. So the Europeans came to the west coast in Africa, and what they built was exactly the same architecture what they knew from the European countries. So they were building castles, and the castles were so the only reason for the castle was, so this is just a small detail of a map from today's Ghana and Nigeria. And so this is the highest density of fortresses in Africa, maybe the most dense collection, or let's say density of international fortresses. So every 30 to 50 kilometers you found, even today you find the remainings of an old castles by the Dutch, by the Portuguese, by the British people. So they all came there, and you see. So you see what was written: the Ivory Coast, Gold Coast, Slave Coast. So they came there just to get the resources from the continent. And it is also interesting to see that they only had the castles, and that's somehow the first urbanizations on the coastline only. And so this is, so for many, I would say for 200 years, this was the case, that the Europeans came to Africa, but didn't go to the so-called hinterlands, to all these areas which were more inside the continent. So they remained along the coast. And even today, the biggest cities, or the main part of the urban population is living in cities along the coastline. And but what happened? So it's of course they were doing a kind of industrialization of slavery. So I don't need to talk too much about this about slavery, but what is interesting to see here is, so this is in the so-called Guinea Gulf, so which is today's Nigeria, and you see that this kind of starting urban structure. So these were all a kind of prisons of areas where they tried to collect, or to collect the slaves, and then they were shipped mainly to the US, but also to Europe. And you see the Portuguese were there, the French, the English, so the Dutch. So they all were just sitting next to each other and fighting with local people who were partly supporting the Europeans in finding and capturing slaves brought to their homelands. So, and this is, and I'm showing you two structures on the left-hand side. So this is in KwaZulu-Natal, which is a traditional homestead, following more or less the structure that I just showed you from Ron English. On the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, it's a farming spot where they tried to grow rubber. And also here we have these so the small round areas. So these are the huts for the slaves, and this in the center we see the floor plan of the head and the director of this rubber plantation. So this is it's an early example of how the Europeans tried to not to copy but to follow local traditional structures, which still remain a kind of village. So we cannot talk about an urban structure, and even today I would say that African cities, if we talk about the identity of African cities, most of them, you could even say today, they are a collection, or let's say a kind of community of villages. So you do not find, or in a very few cities, you will find that kind of capitalist system of a city where you have a high density of buildings and high buildings in the city center, but very low-rise buildings in the outskirts. So African cities are mainly quite low, so you won't find so many skyscrapers. And you can, I try to rush through the history just to get an understanding. So of course, 49 countries in the Sub-Saharan Africa, you can tell 49 different histories or stories how they developed. But the cities of Monrovia and Freetown, Monrovia, as we know, was never a colony. So it was bought by Americans and then given to freed slaves who returned to Liberia, And the city structures, what we find in Monrovia, but also in Freetown, which is Sierra Leone. So it was just following the urban structures, what we found or what we find also in the cities in the US. So if you go further west to the Midwest, so all these new developments of cities, new foundation of cities, we have this grid, but also we find this grid in Freetown, which was that time a British colony. And trying to bring to bring a European structure, a grid or some kind of orthogonal grid into the city, into this, let's say, chaotic traditional native structures of local people. We can also find in Ouagadougou, which is today's Burkina Faso, an aerial picture from 1930, which was then a French colony. So we cannot only say that it was only the Brits who did some kind of grid. No, it was also the French colonizers who were also trying to civilize and Europeanize these local African people. So without any understanding or even investigations or research of village structures and trying to develop or to transform that into a modern language. And what is so interesting also in this picture, also taken in the early 30s in today's South Sudan, you can see how, so it's quite obvious that in these quite modern villas in the center of this picture, you see most likely this was housing for white people, for colonizers. We see a kind of mix of traditional houses plus looks a little bit more wealthy or more rich, let's say servants who worked for these colonizers. And the more we go to the left of the picture, so then the more simple the buildings become. But even here, it's not this natural and indigenous structure of what we find in the traditional homesteads or villages. No, everything was very accurate and following an urban structure and an urban planning. So I'm showing this because these were this segregation. So this is another example of Elizabeth Will, Lubumbashi, in today's Congo. So we see how on the left hand side, city européenne, zone neutre, and city indigene. So it shows really that on the right hand side, local people were housed. On the left hand side, the European city, and in between just a huge gap, nothing, empty space as a zone neutral. So that means to have a distance, to separate the people and to separate the white from the black. So we see that here in 1929, also in the way how the urban structure was planned, and how how segregation came into realization, came into buildings, and came into urban planning. And we have this. We can show so many. We can find so many examples on how new developments were segregating everything. So it was the time after the war when the Charter of Athens. So just dividing all the function of the city was quite popular. And we have mining cities like here in Fria, in Guinea, or then what was the next phenomenon, master plan for Gaborone, Botswana. So all these cities or all these countries became independent, and of course they were starting to do some new capitals. But also in these post-war eras, so we also had the Cold War influencing the city development in Africa. And another example from Zanzibar, where the East Germany sent urban planners and architects who were building these kind of mass housing units. So this is not panel building. So some people think this is panel building. No, this is made with coral stone. But you see, it's still following the same philosophy, the same theory of urban planning, what they also did in the whole Soviet Union, but also in Eastern Europe and East Germany. So it's so rich, and I'm just jumping to another 3 decades of 70s, 80s, and 90s. So the planning and construction of new capitals, Dodoma, Tanzania, the master plan made in 1974. So where they tried to plan a new city based on the idea of small villages. So small villages around a small center, they are joining together and to create a new city. So then we had also this other example of Yamoussoukro, Ivory Coast. So in the early 80s, where the then president tried to build, or not only tried, but he succeeded in building a cathedral bigger than the Cathedral of Peter in the Vatican. So just completely overscaled in an area where this kind of architecture is very foreign, but it was built and it's still existing. So it's quite impressive. But also, Stefan, you mentioned that before in the late 70s it started, but then it was implemented in the 90s. Abuja, Kenzo Tange did the master plan, and then this was further developed. And you see, you can also recognize here these structures of urban villages trying to create a new city. So I'm just trying to rush what is happening today. And when we talk about urbanization processes today in Africa, we really need to focus on this migration, smuggling, and conflict areas. So I'm just focusing on Western Africa only. So the whole area it's a risk area, especially Burkina Faso and Mali, near Niger, but also the south of Algeria. So it's a transit routes, all these transit routes going from Western Africa, from coast cities to Europe. We have a huge migration to Europe from West Africa. You can compare that with migration processes to the US from Latin America. So we do have thousands, 10,000 of people trying to migrate through the Mediterranean Sea, mainly to Spain and to Italy. So very dangerous, and thousands are dying each year. So we have these processes, but we also have, and the question remains, how the cities, especially in this case Bamako, within the Sahel zone, how they are reacting. So they have this young population. The young population unemployment is a big problem. Poverty is a big problem, and but also on the other hand, the urbanization process is not everyone is moving and migrating to Europe, but also the cities are growing. And Bamako is one of these examples. They have the northern part of Mali. So Bamako is the capital of Mali. So the northern part of Mali, a civil war migration, people are migrating from the northern part of Mali to the central part where Bamako is located, and so Bamako was considered the fastest growing city in the world. And they tried to, you see again this idea to not only have one center, but it was the capital of city centers. So this was an idea which was developed in a couple of years ago, and this reminded me. You see this example on the right hand side. You remember? So this was a close-up of Dodoma. So what is happening today in Africa? So this is just it's an aerial picture by an American photographer. Johannesburg, South Africa, segregation even today, even 30 years after the end of the apartheid. And you see on the left-hand side this traditional, not a homestead, but a traditional village, like a circle surrounding a small square in the middle. And then on the right-hand side, we see these housing developments on the right-hand side, social housing in the center, more middle class, or even richer areas. So we have everything just to each other. They're not really connected. We have just different parts and different villages, let's say. So this is what we find in Africa. But what is this? Is this what we want? So this remains as a big question. And I just tried in the end of my presentation just to show you some latest developments. So this is an idea for a new city 20 kilometers south of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, where a group of French urban planners and architects tried to do a planning for a new city of 50,000 people. So this how was the plan 5 years ago. This is how it looks today. At least the streets are already prepared, and this is just expecting. So it's quite challenging to imagine how it will look like in 5 years and 10 years. But at least we see that something is growing, and new cities are popping up like new cities are mushrooming everywhere in Africa, just to as an answer to this urbanization process, what we find. But we also have areas, and this is an example from Bamako in Mali, where these migrants from the northern part of Mali are coming, and they're just this is just it's just an area of old rubbish, and they just went there because it was an empty space, and they just started to build a new village, and it's surprising. So these are some images from the inside. It's surprising how well organized even this refugee camp is. Yeah, it's quite sad seeing the children living playing over there, but this is the reality not only in Bamako but in the whole Sub-Saharan area. So another problem is, of course, not only migration to this of course migration due to this civil wars, and South Sudan, Ethiopia is also a case. But here it also comes together with changing of the climate change and natural catastrophes brought so many refugees to Kakuma, which is said to be the biggest refugee camp in the world, with more than 200,000 people. And this is already Kakuma 4, a picture from 2018. And this is how the people are. So they arrived there, and United Nations is offering a small hut for them, and so just comparing with Kakuma 1. So this is the other picture. So we can expect that Kakuma 4 will look like in 10-20 years looks like this. So it's not this a refugee camp for just a short period of time, but it will be a refugee camp which remains, and which will be the initial point for a new city. And also here we see, so this is 20 years old, 200,000 people living in this area, but we don't see any urbanization process of what we would expect in Europe or in the US. So it remains on this low-rise level of a village. So, but what is happening in parallel? So parallel, China. So we have Chinese investment in Africa. So they built the biggest stadiums, it might be in Brazzaville, in Lilongwe, or in Dakar. Huge stadiums. The state of China was also donating a complete new a railway line with all these around 10 stations from Mombasa and the coastline to the Indian Ocean in Kenya to the capital of Nairobi, and they just built this huge railway station just in the middle of nowhere. So the question will remain, so what is happening there? What kind of village, what kind of urban structure we are going to expect in the next years, in the next generation around these stations? I don't know. I didn't see any development plans around these areas. But China is also, so wherever we find natural resource, where we find oil, where we find bauxite, and all these very materials which are demanded in the world market. So China also made a huge investment for the city of Quilamba in Angola. Angola is said to be one of the richest oil-driven countries in the world. So the Chinese built a huge city for the mid-class people in Angola, 30 kilometers away from the city center of Luanda. So also this is something we see that, and in this huge continent, wherever you go, you see all these huge Chinese developments. Of course, we could say at least something is happening. So there's some progress, some development. But on the other hand, what we know, China in return expects that those countries would accept or follow the political line of China, which is there is only one China, so there is no independence of Taiwan, for example. And the contracts the states are doing is that they don't pay the Chinese state. So they do some kind of contract so that they pay them with natural resources, with gold, with oil, with all these the rich materials what they have in their ground. And this makes it quite difficult to evaluate or just to understand what kind of economical processes are working there, because this is not made really with money, but just with natural. It's just a natural exchange of services and resources. So I'm trying to finish my presentation with a question: what is really needed? And so architects like Norman Foster had quite smart ideas, because it's just impossible to implement infrastructure, streets, railway system to the whole country, to the whole continent. So, but still, we need to guarantee that all the people in Africa could participate in the civilization of our modern world. So what he was doing is, especially for remote areas, he was proposing a system of drone ports just to allow to ship medicine, to ship light materials from one point to the other, where during rain season, for example, the streets are blocked, or there are no railway systems, and there are no aircrafts or airports, whatever. So this was the idea what he was suggesting and presenting in the Architecture Biennale in 2016. So it's the combination of low tech and high tech. And the same idea also had the Berlin-based architects Graft 10 years ago. So they were developing a so-called solar kiosk, which is completely independent from power, electrical power, and is producing the electrical power by itself with all these photovoltaic elements. And in some areas, these solar kiosks are implemented, are built, and they are the only possibility for the local community to have electrical power during the night. And it's a kind of model system, so you can use them not only as a solar kiosk for buying some sweets or matches or whatever, but also to extend them to have some medical health centers, but also some administrational offices. So what else is needed? So I think if we talk about the future of Africa, we need to talk about very, very simple systems, simple architecture. Simplicity is something what we need to support. So we won't need any glass and steel office towers somewhere, as long as the majority of the people, especially in this case here in the Saal area, Saal zone, where they do not have a proper sanitary systems or sanitary stations. And so this is an example from Fara Studio from Italy. So they tried to implement very, very simple village centers with a sanitary system. It's a toilet, an electrical power station, a shower, a water supply, very, very simple basic needs for a village community, and this is something what they started in 2006, which is still ongoing. But also latest ideas by other architects. So Loden Holmes, a young architect from South Africa, he was developing a kind of growing system of buildings. You see on the left-hand side. So the first unit just built with some potential spaces. And we go further to the right, so the center and to the right, and we see all these red areas being built when the family is growing, when there is more money available in the family, and they're continuing working and building on the construction side. And of course, we have very simple construction system like this sandbag construction, which is very much used in South Africa. Luinda Palva is one of these architects who was developing that very much, and also trying to do some challenging architecture, some quite nice architecture. And the German-based architect Anna Heringer, she's also working not only in Africa but globally. She's always trying to do modern architecture, but using traditional techniques. And you see this kindergarten design, the construction side on the right-hand side. What was the idea? So also this ideas. So very small scale projects, of course, but possible to implement and to build by the local community. And then just reminding, going back to this figure, 400 million people are moving into cities, or the urban population is increasing by the number of 400 million people within the next generation. And I'm just trying to finish my presentation with this. A picture I took last year in Koudougou, which is in the western part of Burkina Faso. It's another project by Francis Kéré, who was Stefan mentioned it already, the Pritzker Prize winner for this year. The first time that the African architecture was awarded, and he did this kind of development for the Burkina Institute of Technology. It's 110 kilometers west of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, and this is also combined with a school. And you see this idea. So whenever we would see this in 10-20 years, so this would be a small village which has been growing around this idea of bringing together the community, young people, educated. In the center, we see this the server for this institute. So this has also been not a playground, but a ground for doing some experiments with new materials, also by Francis Kéré. That's also one of the reasons why he was awarded. He's not only trying to interpret to transform traditional forms of architecture into modern language, but also tries to work with the local community, trying to do a transfer of knowledge whenever he is doing a project. So this was just a very, very quick and fast rush through the civilization and urbanization processes in Africa, what we find today. And yeah, you might understand. We could I did already a whole series of lectures on this subject. It is so rich, and in fact, it just there should be more responsibility on my side to not rush so fast through this rich subject. But we also have to say that as long as the basic knowledge on Africa is not so high, so we have to. So I will be going, and I will be continuing doing these this fast overviews, just to allow so the guests and the students, yeah, to learn a little bit about Africa.
Thank you, Philipp. Thank you very much, Philipp. Indeed, a fascinating topic, and we are very interested in it. I mean, this is nothing new. It's a rediscovery that has happened many times when we look back, you know, from Claude Lévi-Strauss in the 1950s, an anthropologist and structuralist looking at Brazil, for instance, but also Africa. And then you will recall Bernard Rudowski's important book and exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1964, Architecture Without Architects, looking at those community structures and what we can learn. But how do we do this without having our Western ideals in mind is always a question. So here are a couple of comments. I mean, the staggering growth of cities in Africa. One question is always, or let's start the first question about the processes in place to guide this urban explosion that we are seeing. And the question is that I wanted to ask you, are you feeling optimistic or rather pessimistic about the future of cities and urbanization in general in Africa? Or are you also disillusioned, like many experts have become about this process? I see there is what's driving is your curiosity and openness to be non-judgmental, to discover the rich culture, which is great, and there are great life lessons visiting these cities, rethinking ideas of community and public space. So one question would be, how optimistic are you about the urbanization of Africa, and what lessons can we learn from African urbanization? What would you say?
So I think it's a very important matter, or let's say it's a very important issue that we should put all our energy to educate architects in Africa. So I think we are not living in a period anymore where Westerners or academics from other parts of the world go somewhere as a kind of modern colonizers and tell the local people how to develop a modern city or a contemporary city. So I think of course, we could work as consultants in Africa, but not as a consultant in showing how to do it or teaching how to do it, but in teaching how to learn from their own tradition. And so once the people everywhere in the world, once they have learned from their own tradition and then transformed, let's say, their experience into new buildings, building typologies. So Africa would have the possibility just to jump, what I was just showing in the last images, to jump from this low tech into high tech without having all these periods of industrialization, what destroyed so much in Europe and in the US. And of course, Africa would have the possibility to learn from the mistakes which were done in the Western world, or even in the whole world, Asia. Let's say, so the last huge urbanization processes we had in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s in Asia, East Asia, first in Korea, but also in China. So still ongoing. So we would have the same figures on 400 million people moving to cities in China as well. But look what is happening in China. So the answer could not be to put them, to house all of them in multi-story high-rises, anonymous. No, I think this is not the case. So we have a complete different climate zone in Africa. We have completely different materials, and we have a completely different culture on how to live in the family, how to live in a community. And I think this, whatever we talk about, whatever we think about the future of African cities, we should also consider what are the requirements for the people. And then it should not be our glasses from the European way, how to modernize an area, or let's say a region where we would say this is not so much developed as we would expect that. No, so even in a very, very simple, in a very basic, in a village with basic needs, we can do beautiful architecture. Francis Carré is one of these outstanding architects who's doing this. And so this gives us the proof that it's possible, even in rural areas in Africa, we can do beautiful architecture, nice architecture, and we can also do nice cities or the villages.
So thank you, Philipp, for answering this question. Our colleague Hegel is pointing out the jump in dimension on some of those images. We have a series of questions that came in, if that's okay. Just for clarification, one attendee is writing, Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, is changing, and we are seeing a lot of skyscraper activity. Look at Upper Hill and Westlands area. In fact, this trend is increasing as urban competitiveness is increasing across cities in the continent. So I would beg to defer with your comment that you will not find skyscrapers. Okay, yes, interesting point. Some of the modernizing cities, Nairobi, for instance, fast growing, maybe Lagos in some areas are having those skyscrapers. And then it continues. I think that Africans need to lead on their own development as it relates to urbanization, something that you just also confirmed, the way we Westerners could be involved as consultants, but learning from the history and culture. The attendee writes, and what this means is that we should go back to our roots and challenge Western ideals, challenging Western ideals of modernity, and begin to create, reimagine, and develop cities that work for Africans by Africans. Okay, so here is an argument that African architecture and development by Africans challenging Western ideals of modernity. Do you want to comment on that briefly?
Yeah, I mean, so since we have published this huge 7-volume set of books on African architecture, I have been discussing a lot with colleagues, but also with critiques, and one of the critique was, so if I'm focusing on the on this native architecture, the native structures in Africa, so I was once I was asked if I would not allow African people to modernize or to have a civilized technology in their homes. So should we all live? If you should all go back to our small round hut with a thatched roof? No, we should not. But what I'm saying is, so even in these native African structures and village structures, we can find a spirit of architecture, a spirit of urban culture, and this should not be erased. So we should really try to investigate and to do some research before we educate, or we try to consult local architects and local planners. So I think so the answer how to urbanize this fast growing urban population. So this answer could also only be given by African architects. So this is what I'm saying. So but still, so this is it's the curiosity of my personality to dive in and to see what is happening there and what we can find there. And this would be another lecture. I could show you the structures, what I found in African villages. So the same structures you can find in North America, in all these museums which are showcasing the so-called Native American Indian culture. And if you look to the architecture, it's exactly the same structures. And you can also find these structures in Siberia, in all these people still living there in the tundra. So this and you can also, if you go back into our European history, so it was the Romans who just destroyed that and urbanized half of Europe, but especially when it comes to Germany, which was not always covered by the Romans. So in the early centuries of our modern age, so we had similar buildings, and this is what I'm saying. Doing some research and trying to understand what we can see in Africa, what we can find in Africa, brings us back to our roots as a Homo sapiens. So you can understand, you can learn the DNA of architecture of the mankind. And this is something you can find in Africa, you can find in North America, you can find also nearly everywhere, but you have to go into the roots and go into the history.
DNA in architecture, that's very interesting. Thank you. So here the attendee makes the point, it is important to give room and space to African urbanism that is untainted by Western ideals. So we probably could talk this point much more. There is an interesting, there are several books published by Udo Kultermann. Udo Kultermann was a German professor who had a career in the US at an architecture school, and he died recently, and he published a couple of books in the 70s and 80s, Architecture in Africa. I don't know if you know those. And he's discussing those questions at a large extent already in those books. They are kind of key early publications looking at Africa a long time before it was done by others. So here we have a couple of other questions sent in by Fortino. What are the housing and transportation aspirations of middle-class people in Africa? You know, what do they want? The transport, you know, do they all want the air-conditioned American bungalow and the big SUV car, or are there other trends? What do we see there? The aspirations in housing and transportation in the middle class, the emerging middle class in Africa.
So I think it would be not professional and academic from my side to give an answer what the African middle class really wants and needs. So I think this answer should be given by sociologists who have been working in this field. But what I can recommend is it's just some figures you can do with a calculator. If 400 million people plus need urban housing in the next 30 years, just bring it back. What would that mean per year? We would have per year to build a city with 12 million people. So each year we have to build the size of one of the biggest cities in the world for each year to house this urban population. And we need to find an answer for that. And the answer could not be low-rise huts and low-rise buildings made out of concrete, let's say. So we need to discuss a typology which gives an answer to this urbanization process. So in my understanding, we would need to talk about 3 or 4-story buildings, high density. The material should not be something which should be imported, local materials. We should need to discuss how to work with adobe, how to work with earth. What are the alternatives of using concrete? Wood in some areas might be a solution, but if we go further north to the Sahel area, so the wood is one of the most expensive building materials, so we need to find another answer for that. So we can only talk about typologies, and when we talk about typologies, I'm just repeating myself, 3 to 4 floors, high density, multifamily housing, which might be a problem for some areas where they are from the tradition only live in a small village. The family lives in one village or in a small unit, and then a couple of 100 meters away, another family is living. Are they going to move together? Is that possible? And how they are, so this from the social point of view, is it possible? And to find an architectural solution, I think this shouldn't be a problem, but I think we should talk about the typology of a multi-story, high density housing unit, which could grow. And it should, and maybe we talk about very simple constructions. I'm just saying, put a garage somewhere and put the next garage 10 feet, 30 feet away. and then these two garages could be joined by a new construction, but not not now, but maybe in 2 or 3 years. So once the family is growing. So I think in some areas of Africa, we just need to say goodbye to this aesthetics of architecture, what we expect when we open architecture magazine. So I'm very sure that we need to go back to what we were saying, architecture without architecture. I think this is something what we need to support these ideas, but giving some advices and some consultancy for all these people, just to support in just changing the typology, because just look to all these cities, they're sprawling into the agglomeration. So everything is one floor. It is, so we call it slum. If you go in, you see that even with these so-called slums, you can find structures of organization, structures of politics, structures of family living. So they are self-sustaining somehow. And we need to just repeating myself again and again, we need to find a higher density, and higher density means we have to go higher and higher. 3 to 4 floors is what we consider everywhere in the world. We consider 3 to 4 floors. We consider that as a human scale for urban structures and residential areas.
And you don't need an elevator for
you
3
don't need the
floors,
elevator,
which is
right.
important. But because we do not build this 12 million people city every year, the gap is constantly getting bigger. So there is a looming crisis. And how do we solve that? You mentioned already medium rise density, but also prefabrication using concrete to avoid expensive timber and steel. Using concrete is using local materials, like already Louis Kahn did many years back, having set up for big projects in Dhaka, for instance, or in Ahmedabad in India, local production of bricks, training people and using local labor and local earth, mud, to produce and burn the bricks that he then used to build his large-scale monumental architecture. But we cannot be careful enough that we do not end up with those failed experiments again, where we put those people into prefabricated concrete boxes. That was tried before. And looking at the Chinese solution that you showed, this aerial photo, that didn't look very attractive to me. So here's another question that came in, maybe the last one today. Do you think it would be useful to create service stations and education centers for nomadic populations to improve their quality of life? So nomadic populations that move around, maybe with cattle, and should they have service stations and education centers that they can reach and dock on and spend some time before they move on? Is this a solution? Is this something that could be interesting? Fortino Acosta is asking.
Yeah, I would even say that this is it's not really a question. So if you would allow me to change or to revise the question, it's not a question if we do that or if it is needed. I would just transform this question in how could we design this, or how could we implement that? And I'm not saying that we should these kind of nomadic people to stop with their life following the cattle during the whole year. No, so we should. I think this is so what we consider as appropriate in the 21st century, that each culture has the right to first of all to develop itself, but to remain in the culture what they were living in for generations, for centuries. So if we talk about nomadic people, and especially in the Sahel region, we have lots of nomadic people. So yeah, of course. So we also need to find a program on how to improve their lives, and as long as they don't want to become residents of a city or some residents or permanent residents of a village, of course we should allow them to get the children educated, to have access to fresh water, to all the infrastructure what they need. And yes, of course we also should support these kind of ideas. And you were mentioning Louis Kahn. So we also have so the Greek architect Doxiadis, who was also working not only in Africa, but he was working everywhere, but not in the Western world. And that's the reason why he's somehow he has been forgotten. People don't know him very well in the Western world. Doxiadis, Konstantinos Doxiadis, and he was also trying to find architectural solutions for people in then called developing countries. And he was also trying to combine, to give an answer of trying to combine modern architecture with traditional building typologies. And if we go to all these cities or villages, what he was responsible for, so we have examples in Nigeria, in Ghana, but also in Baghdad. So we even could go to Baghdad, and you can find structures by Doxiadis in Baghdad, which is today one of the most livable quarters, because he was also following this idea to have low rise, 3 to 4 floors, townhouses, small units. People were not living on different apartments, but they were living, or they're living in one small house connected with the ground. So this is we can talk for hours about the idea how to bring people into responsibility in creating and developing an urban structure. And of course, the first question is always, who owns the ground? And this is something we should start with when we talk about urbanization in Africa. We also need to talk about new real estate policies, to not give responsibility to private or state-owned developers, but also to bring the people into responsibility to decide whether and what to build on their own property.
A complex, big task ahead, a fascinating topic. By the way, there is a new book on Doxiadis and his work in Pakistan, which came out of a PhD by Ahmed Khan, which is wonderful. Doxiadis still to be rediscovered, his work in the 60s and 70s of last century. But coming back to Philipp Meuser and his wonderful lecture telling us this morning about an evening in Berlin, where you are, telling us about Sub-Saharan African urbanization. I thank you very much, Philipp, for your contribution and to this important lecture series, and wonderful lecture, very well illustrated, and also to all attendees for their valuable comments and questions. And I hope you enjoyed it, and it is all recorded and is going to be on our YouTube channel together with the many other lectures we have organized for the American Institute of Architects. Thank you from the AIA and from the School of Architecture here at UNLV, live from Las Vegas. And all the warmest regards and thanks to Berlin, and say hello to Natasha and your family. Thank you, Philipp, for today.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.